afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the CGS webinar, Designing Law-Attentive Policies for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion with our colleagues from Education Council. We're really excited you're here. As people are joining, I'm going to give people some time to get into the Zoom, but I want to go over a few logistics for our webinar today. So we do have a Q&A feature available. If you have questions for our panelists at any time, submit them using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer those in a moderated discussion towards the end. This is being recorded, so the recording and the presentation slides will be shared with attendees, and will also be posted on the CGS website and YouTube channel after the live event. So if you're worried about not catching all of it, it is, like all of our webinars, being recorded and it will be made available. And at this time, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to CGS President Suzanne Ortega.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome so much, colleagues. As Sarah said, my name is Suzanne Ortega, and I have the real privilege of serving as president of the Council of Schools. And I'd like to personally welcome you to this webinar on law-attentive policies for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Given the really broad importance of today's topic, CGS has invited both CGS member institutions, but also other organizations who have enormous stakes in this question. And we've asked them to participate. So I really want to personally welcome those of you I have not yet met, and give you a special welcome as you attend this first CGS webinar. Today's topic has never been more critical for graduate education and for the graduate schools. For more than 60 years, CGS has served as a primary organization that works to advance graduate education and research. And diversity, equity, and inclusion has always been a cornerstone of our work. We are really pleased to collaborate with Educational Council today on this webinar. Educational Council is an organization that seeks to advance equitable educational systems from early childhood through post-secondary education. Much of the work you will hear about today, in fact, had Educational Council as a co-partner, was generously supported by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation through a grant on supporting equity-minded graduate education in a changing legal landscape. As many of you are aware, or at least our CGS members are aware, this project was launched about 4 months ago following the Supreme Court's 2023 SFFA decision. In the wake of that decision, we believed that there would be the potential for uncertainty about what were the legally viable options for continuing to pursue our core mission of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So working in conjunction with our advisory committee, legal experts, graduate deans, and faculty, our goals for this loan-funded project are to better understand how universities and graduate schools are impacted by the Supreme Court decision, and to try to promote some common understandings of what, in fact, are legally sound, equitable practices among graduate deans, faculty, and university councils. So, to that end, today's webinar is designed for university leaders who are seeking to support their communities, their students, their colleagues, their faculty, as they navigate the uncertainty ushered in by changes in federal law, which of course are accompanied by legislation proposed, pending, or passed in some US states that have placed further restrictions on efforts to advance the diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda. While universities have had over a year to respond to the SFFA ruling, it is safe to say that challenges and uncertainties remain. Today, we will hear from 4 experts, distinguished experts who will provide their perspectives on continuing efforts to support DEI at US graduate institutions. And so at this point, I'm very, very pleased to welcome and introduce our speakers. Trevina Bird, is Vice President and General Counsel and Board Secretary of American University. Art Coleman is Managing Partner and Co-Founder of Educational Council. Wojtek Hodźkozaiko is Dean of the Graduate School at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And Jamie Lewis Keith is Distinguished Senior Law and Policy Fellow at Educational Council. Thanks so much to each of you for joining us and being willing to present as a member of our distinguished panel. At this time, welcomes are through, and we'll turn to our real work. Julia, I will turn it over to you. Julia is our Vice President at CGS for Best Practices and Strategic Initiatives to get us started. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you, Suzanne. So before we get started, I'll briefly go over the plan for today's event. Our webinar is 1 hour and 15 minutes. We hope that your schedule will allow you to stay for the full time, especially since we're saving questions for the end. For the next 25 minutes or so, we'll hear from Education Council. And Art Coleman and Jamie Lewis Keith are going to lay the groundwork for us. We'll hear about the legal background on the SFFA decision and state-based anti-DEI developments, which of course are an important context for universities seeking to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion while also navigating risk. Art and Jamie will be focusing on what they call can-do strategies and actions for advancing DEI in current legal environments. And at a time when we're hearing a lot about what we can't do, we very much appreciate that they are focusing on what is possible. So following Ed Council's presentation, we'll move to a roundtable discussion, including all of our speakers. And we'll explore both the roles of graduate deans and university general counsel in this space that Jamie and Art have sort of laid the groundwork for. We know that you will have questions and thoughts to share, and we've reserved plenty of time for that at the end of the webinar. You can submit a question at any time, and we'll address as many of these as we can in the last part of our time. So with that, I'll turn things over to Jamie Lewis Keith from Education Council. Jamie?
Thank you, Julia, and thank you, Suzanne, and welcome everyone. Today, we're going to note the Supreme Court's highly flawed Students for Fair Admission ruling and the current legal and political landscape, but we'll mainly focus on contextualizing legal risk within total mission risk. And we're going to focus, as Julia said, on what graduate deans and lawyers can do to advance diverse and equitable learning communities with the panels, and we hope with the audience's insights. Next slide, please. So let's start with the law. This webinar builds on Ed Council's new resource that offers 25 actions in the green low-risk zone and 9 actions in the reasonable but less clearly decided yellow risk zone under federal non-discrimination law across 8 available avenues to advance DEI. So please check it out. Next slide, please. We are offering law-informed directional guidance to help leaders and lawyers pursue sustainable mission-critical DEI action, but we are not providing legal advice today. Mindset matters. Next slide, please. Mission is the North Star for all DEI action. Law is just a design parameter that you can navigate. It is not an impenetrable barrier, and an institution's risk tolerance is another design parameter. Academics navigate design parameters for innovation every day, and many avenues remain to advance DEI. So please don't be intimidated by the law. Understand it to innovate and achieve your DEI-dependent mission to serve all students well. Next, please. Importantly, legal risk is only one DEI-related risk. It must be balanced with the high mission risk of not achieving an institution's DEI interests. Defying clear legal prohibitions in the red zone, or assuming legal risk disproportionate to the mission benefit received, can result in both unnecessary mission exposure and worse law with broad impacts on many institutions if a suit challenges actions that are clearly at odds with law. But excessive legal risk aversion, not acting in the yellow zone where the law may be unclear, but there's a principled legal position to advance important mission aims, results in excessive mission risk. Each institution must find its right risk-reward balance with advice of its own counsel. So know the law's baselines, but don't overread them. DEI is not outlawed and many avenues remain to achieve it. Next, please. Now for those legal baselines. The court has long interpreted federal non-discrimination law, which applies to all activities of all institutions that receive federal funding, to generally prohibit race-based differential treatment of individuals when conferring any benefit or opportunity, with exceptions. Next, please. The Supreme Court affirmed the exceptions require, first, a legally compelling aim that is measurable by a court. Next. And second, any means that consider a person's racial status, their group membership, to be narrowly tailored to achieve that compelling aim, with evidence that race-neutral strategies alone will not suffice, an ascertainable end, and no negative stereotyping or zero-sum race-based effect. Defying long precedent and the science on the real benefits of diversity, the ruling most consequentially holds that educational diversity benefits for all students, long defined as enhanced teaching and learning, civic and workforce readiness, empathy, cross-racial understanding, and reduced stereotyping, are no longer legally compelling enough to justify limited use of race status in admission. That's the red. And neither is remedying general societal inequity. We must adhere to the ruling and its principle that a legally compelling interest is required to justify any race status, which applies to benefits beyond admissions. But the ruling lacks intellectual, legal, and factual integrity, and it harms students of color, so don't give it more effect than it requires. Indeed, the court held that an institution can define its mission as it sees fit, and that educational diversity interests are commendable and worthy. The court explicitly endorsed considering a person's own aspirations, inspirations, knowledge, skills, and character qualities when related to mission, and gained from their own experience of race. So those qualities gained from race-based experience. Long-defined diversity interests are not outlawed, but they just don't justify considering racial status. Other can-dos include that without having a legally compelling interest, you can still embrace a DEI-dependent mission and act to welcome and value all students. To do that, you can individually consider qualities and knowledge that a student gained from their experience of race, as I was saying, without making race-based assumptions. Also, race can be the subject of any person's expertise, actions toward equity, or deep knowledge, or the subject of a program as long as race doesn't limit participation. Authentic neutral priorities like access for socioeconomic, first generation, or under-resourced school background, and inclusive barrier removal or systems changes are not outlawed. The court prohibited only the one tool to achieve diversity. It's important, but it's only one, considering an individual's bare racial status, their group membership, in determining admission decisions and likely other benefits. But there's a lot of room to act with authenticity in the many remaining DEI advancing avenues. So remember that this is not the end of diversity and equity in higher education. Also, keep in mind that educational equity is the root of our shared mission. As leaders, you can pursue diversity and equity, go beyond numbers and one-off interventions with one-time funding to really focus on reducing barriers and making changes in longstanding policies that have exclusionary effects, to not just navigate, but actually mitigate the ruling and achieve diverse and equitable higher education that centers minoritized groups, addresses all students' needs, and is an institution-wide responsibility. Also, we can, over time, develop new DEI-related evidence-based compelling interests to test on the right facts at the right time. Next slide, please. The Supreme Court ruled on the means that can and can't be used to achieve an institution's commendable and worthy DEI mission. So don't conflate that ruling with what some state laws have done. Unlike the court, these state laws ban DEI as the subject matter of some public higher education programs, funding, and staffing, and there's a great variety from one state to the next. Also, don't conflate what the court did with what anti-DEI advocates are saying that really is a false narrative that DEI is illegal, full stop. Suits are unavoidable in the foreseeable future, so there's too much at stake for bravado acting at odds with the law, or for retreat. It's a time for committed, strategic, and well-informed use of every avenue the court left available in the green and yellow legal risk zones. And some of these avenues may be useful in banned states too. So now I'm going to ask for the next slide and turn this panel over to Art, who's going to offer more on the can-do examples.
Thanks so much, Jamie. So we're going to pick up from sort of the baselines that Jamie has just outlined, principally under federal law. We're not going to get into the details, at least in presentation, on the nuances of some of the state law restrictions that go beyond federal law, although we can certainly address some of those questions if you like at the end in the Q&A. So let's go to the next slide. This is really just a top line capture. If you look to the resource that we recently published that was mentioned earlier, we've attempted to distill a range of 25 green light practices and 9 yellow to green light practices in the areas that you see outlined here, trying to elevate those policies and practices around program design that can give you confidence in engaging with your legal counsel and other institutional leaders as you're thinking about the design on things from mission to recruitment to selection criteria and more. What I want to elevate in the context of each of these specific arenas, if we can go to the next slide, please, are 3 really driving themes that I think cross all of those barriers. One, to make sure, as we did for 45 years under the precedent that followed Bakke in 1978, mission alignment and articulation of that mission alignment is critical, valuable from an educational policy standpoint, essential from a legal defensibility standpoint. And so make sure that we've got that sort of framework and that understanding of the overarching aims tied to mission that drive and inform how we design the variety of programs and policies that we may be implementing at the graduate school or other levels within the institution of higher education. There is also a subtext to this, which is to ensure the authenticity in aims and design. I often hear behind closed doors, oh, why don't we just find a proxy for? And I will tell you, the word proxy is the one that sends me running, screaming from the room as counsel in the room, because proxy to me communicates, I'm looking for an end run. And I want to remind us all that even as the Chief Justice was in this very disturbing and flawed ruling out racial status to advance diversity goals for the moment, even as he was embracing at a very detailed level the consideration of experience associated with race to advance certain goals. He made it very clear that institutions can't do indirectly what they're prohibited from doing directly. So this question of authenticity is going to remain front and center, both for the landscape of challenges to practices, and we will see some coming out of the data that's being released, and new evolving challenges that we are beginning to see on the forefront as the forces that are anti-DEI are not giving up on any front to challenge at every turn policies and practices that advance these goals. So authenticity is really sort of critical here. I'm going to tackle the question of merit and excellence on the next slide. So let me just go to, I want to elevate just a couple of the very specific points we made around program design within the guidance before we bring in our panel for a conversation here. To reinforce the point Jamie made earlier, this court recognized that the diversity goals of Harvard and UNC were not only solid, but laudable and commendable. They simply didn't cross the threshold of being legally compelling to justify the consideration of racial status. I think it is critically important that we not take that sort of endorsement and say, I don't need to worry about issues of mission or articulation of goals and objectives. I actually think we are in a moment, unlike any other, where we have the opportunity to reestablish a more robust and compelling narrative than we have ever established in the past. In fact, if you reflect on the past 45 years of cases before SFFA, we were winning more cases than we were losing on this front, but we were consistently losing the court of public opinion. This is an opportunity to right size, and I think there are still emerging and evolving lessons to be learned. Among them in this space is, number one, let's avoid jargon. We can't simply post up a diversity, equity, and inclusion interest without more and expect it to be understood or accepted. And in fact, we are seeing the shorthand of DEI being weaponized by the radical right in this context. So it is essential that we think through not only the what, but the why, and provide clarity with respect to the educational and potentially field-related interests that may be unique for a particular department in a graduate setting, for instance. And without exception, and this is often where we miss the boat in our first 45 years of engaging with public issues and in communications, we've got to do a better job of expressly aligning and linking the legitimate DEI interests to notions of excellence and merit. And that implicates the ability to talk in educational terms, in terms of the professional fields that we may be advancing, about the what and the why of DEI in that context. Next slide. We have also identified a number of inclusive outreach and recruitment practices here. The simple point I want to make here is that this court and the SFFA decision did not touch issues of recruitment and outreach. And we are actually sitting on top of decades of settled case law that considers inclusive recruitment and outreach to be a policy or a program design that institutions can advance in a comprehensive and inclusive way, even as there may be elements within that broad-based recruitment and outreach to prospective students that have distinct and specific racial elements. Fundamentally, as long as we aren't conferring a particular individual benefit tied to an individual student's racial status, the courts give us significant leeway, which we explain in a lot more detail in the guidance, with respect to our outreach, our recruitment, our pathways efforts, because there it's about where do I invest resources or where do I target in the context of broader interests. Race can play a central role in those conversations to advance our diversity goals in ways that it cannot, frankly, in the context of an admissions decision or a financial aid or scholarship decision where that individual benefit is on the table for a particular student. Go to the next slide. We have also identified a number of green and yellow to green light neutral selection criteria practices. One of the points I want to elevate off of the SFFA decision itself in a kind of perverse way, as bad as the decision was, as Jamie alluded to, the last two paragraphs of the decision actually detail at a historic level. Never before has the court talked at a level of detail that talked about the way institutions can elevate and value qualities that are important to them that may well include recognition of skills, knowledge, experience, and more associated with an individual's experience regarding their race. So this is very much an individualized consideration, but it's tied to qualities that all students, regardless of their race, might excel in or demonstrate particular strength on. And so this actually qualifies as a legally neutral way to think about selection. And it is relevant not only in the admissions context, but to aid and pathways and other programs. And it is a complement to the more traditional neutral criteria that may be considered like a student's wealth or first generation status that could be considered in many cases in tandem with that focus on student experience. We'll go to the next slide. There are then a combination of both inclusive program design structures as well as remedial systemic barrier removal structures that basically elevate these same kinds of interests. And so the avenues for considering traditional neutral criteria that I've just outlined, thinking through a student's skills, knowledge, experience, perspectives associated with their race as subject matter all highly relevant to ways to design policies and programs that should be legally defensible and sustainable, even in the wake of this pretty remarkable Supreme Court decision. I'll also elevate for any of you, particularly in the financial aid space, you may be familiar with a concept known as pool and match, which applies to scholarships in a way to think about design parameters that may allow some effective and innovative navigation of this space. We detail the parameters of pool and match in the guidance we provide. I will simply elevate. We don't have clear federal case law on this, and so it is very much a sort of yellow to green strategy. I would also say that notwithstanding the fact that we have actually regulatory language under Title IX that recognizes pool and match in a sex or gender-based way, we still have some outstanding questions about OCR's ultimate position on pool and match with respect to the consideration of race or ethnicity. Jamie and I have argued in this guidance there's actually no principal distinction to be made between gender and race on this front, given what this allows is a donor's intent associated with race to be translated in a pool of fungible dollars in a neutral way. So we think it's a viable strategy. I would simply say we are just discovering some outstanding OCR issues through some of their enforcement activity. We are on that and attempting to get to some bottom lines, and we'll supplement with information to all of you as soon as we do.
And in the just real quickly, in the graduate context, this kind of thing is it's like, what are the sources of funds that if you're providing the same stipend for everyone, but you have different sources of funds, those funds are fungible. That's the sort of concept that might play out in graduate education. And one other real quickie is that in addition to skills, knowledge, experience, perspectives, the positive kinds of, it doesn't all have to be about suffering, and it can be about the positive heritage that a particular student has relating to their race. So there can be sort of value of those kind of celebration of heritage as well.
Absolutely. All right, let's go to the next slide. And with that, I'm going to invite our two colleagues to join us on screen, if you will, so that we can engage in a more robust conversation around some of these points. And Trevina, I'm going to turn to you first as the resident general counsel on the panel. Always a question about how do we work with our lawyers? And I think you've been had some enlightening and innovative ideas about how general counsel can encourage academic leaders and colleagues to think through design parameters associated with DEI and reach a level of conceptual understanding, even though we lawyers speak our own special language. And so would love to just turn to you first to get your reflections and illustrations in the slides that follow about how you've navigated that space.
Thank you, Art, and thank you, Jamie. Great introduction. I'm happy to be here to participate in this conversation and to kind of translate in some ways all the things you said to some real on-the-ground experience in the trenches, how we've applied the great wisdom that you just imparted. And I'll just say first is a quick introduction that I have advised graduate admissions as well as undergraduate admissions. And I have to say the graduate admissions process is far more challenging in some ways because, of course, it's very decentralized. There's the different disciplinary standards that govern how you would all select a cohort of new students coming in. And I'll let Wojtek talk more about that. He's really far more connected day to day. But how that's relevant to the work that I do, that was really critical for me to have a team approach, to talk across all the different divisions and schools and programs to get an understanding in advance. And I actually did this work before the ruling happened. It started last spring of 24 to understand what everyone needed. What were they doing? What were the admissions processes structured like? Because that was the only way we'd be able to develop a methodology that'd be helpful and could be applied across in a way that was somewhat standardized generally, but really appropriate for mixing the different components around as needed for the unique nature of each academic program and discipline that was represented. And in addition to that, my role is also to stay calm and to have a positive attitude, because people panicked, when this happened and thought, oh no, what are we going to do? There was a measure of kind of paralysis about it. And I often compare the general counsel as kind of like the flight attendant on an airplane. If there's a lot of turbulence and the flight attendant is looking nervous, then everyone is going to panic. So I needed to stay calm and focus and have a can-do attitude and bring people together to say, what's our mission? What's our risk tolerance, as was mentioned before, have a uniform approach about that, and then start to think about how do we develop that methodology that's going to be applicable to each of you, but able to be, again, repurposed appropriately for your unique differences. And then checking back in. So having a cycle of coming back after we've applied the methodology, we've gone through an admission cycle. What do we tweak? What new questions have arisen? And also, how do we apply that to programs that we may not have prioritized before? Because that's the other thing. There's the admissions processes that took, of course, a lot of attention right away, but this cuts across a lot of areas that we have to think about. So the first slide I want to go to next is going to give you a snapshot of how I worked with my university on this issue. This is not a one-size-fits-all. So I think, again, that groundwork that gets laid is what's hugely helpful in informing what practice needs to be applied to make sure that everyone who touches an admissions application understands how to do it. For us, we wanted to make it simple, and we wanted to make the training brief, because we know faculty are heavily involved in the graduate process for admissions, much more than undergraduates. There wasn't going to be just like kind of one committee or one group that's going to, come to one orientation session. We needed to be available to meet with lots of faculty when they could be available. So myself worked on this along with 2 other attorneys in my office, and we, I think, estimated, well over 100 faculty members, if probably more than that we offered 10 different sessions for them to sign up for. And what we did was we taught them the bridge. So what you see in front of you is one of our slides that shows the different elements of how the bridge is built. Okay, so the standards for admissibility have to be identified in advance. So thinking about that before the admission cycle begins, what are the admission attributes that have to be race neutral? They're drawn from the institution's mission. And I will also say that for graduate programs, those admission attributes can also be informed by technical standards associated with the discipline. So for example, medical schools are certainly going to think about what makes a great doctor and how does that translate into what kind of students we're looking for. And sometimes those things might have racial inferences because they are about being able to engage in diverse communities, being able to serve different communities and have that background and affinity. In some ways, it's not about the person's individual racial identity, because that is a race neutral attribute. It doesn't matter what race you are, you can develop those skills. And so that was it's an important exercise to do in advance and make sure that everyone on the committee has the same understanding of what those attributes are, so you can consistently apply them. And then as race comes up, and that was kind of how we taught folks, when race comes up, this is what you do. And we have, find the bridge. And so race could come up in a recommendation letter. It could be in a student's essay, for example, as they're describing their backgrounds. And whenever race comes up, then you have to make sure that you do an individualized assessment as to how that race affected their experiences. Are their experiences referenced there? Does it talk about how that racial experience, how those experiences were influenced by their racial background? That's really important, because when it's just race mentioned alone, and we're making assumptions about what their experience might have been as a result of their race, that could lead to a presumption that we're applying stereotypes. And so you want to make sure that you find the reference to the race is linked to specific experience, and then you link that experience and the race to the admission attribute. All right, and that's the bridge. So if we go to the next slide, I'll show you the visual that seemed to be really helpful for the folks on my campus. And they would walk themselves through it whenever the issue arose. Does the application make reference to the applicant's race? If yes, go to the next one. Does the application include additional information about how the applicant's race has directly shaped their personal experience? Again, if that box is missing, you're going to miss a link in your bridge. You've got to show that connection, or you're going to be potentially stereotyping. And then the third section there has the applicant's race-related personal experience led to the development of a race-neutral personal quality. So someone could express that they're Latina, And we can't assume that because they're Latina, they've had certain kinds of experiences related to a particular community. But if they talk about those experiences have shaped their engagement in familiarity and experience with a particular community, that is actually a race neutral personal quality, because someone who is of any race may have had a similar experience, and that has shaped their admissibility. That leads us to that last box. The race neutral personal quality demonstrates that they have a certain admissions attribute, those big lofty things that we talked about at the beginning of the admission cycle. What do we want in the perfect doctor or someone who's got a PhD in this program? We want them to have these kinds of skills, backgrounds, and experiences. And so that's what leads us to that last box. And if you don't have a gap in your bridge, then you will have, for me, what I find is a legally defensible admissions process. Now, I'll close by saying that this is an applicable methodology to other types of programs. And so what I found is that working with my colleagues at my university, once they got armed with information, you know, they were dangerous. They were sniffing things out that I didn't even know was there. They could surface questions about other kinds of programs that were not on my radar. And that was very, very helpful, because they could apply the same methodology and say, we're going to go ahead and adjust these eligibility standards or this process for reviewing applicants according to this methodology we just learned. Everything has to have a bridge. So I'll stop there.
Before I pass the baton to Jamie, I just want to elevate one point, because it's coming through so loudly and clearly for me, hearing this amazing description. I think you have just elevated the power and importance, and I would argue that the legal necessity at this moment in time of written clarity around policy and practice, unlike any time we've ever seen. I think we've got a long history and tradition of thinking, oh, if I don't write it down, I'm okay because I know what I'm doing. That mentality guided lots of institutions for decades. I think given the very fine lines the court drew between prohibited status and permissible experience, and the necessary link that you've just articulated, because you're elevating these attributes, or as we term them at council, qualities, that forces a rigor and a transparency about decision making. And that clarity can be both very useful from an internal management design standpoint, and I would argue thinking through even how you now talk with prospective students about what are the qualities or attributes you're looking for. So I really like the example.
Thank you. That's exactly right. We don't hide the ball. We talk about it very openly when it comes to recruitment, and make sure that we want everyone to know these are the things we value in all of our students, regardless of their backgrounds, if they bring this to us. So thank you. It's very helpful.
And this is really a terrific illustration, really a good visual. I'll just add that this idea of how experience that someone has, specific experience, links to admissions attributes or qualities. It also links to the concept that race as the subject matter of what a person's knowledge, of their expertise, of their record of having taken action. To include others and so forth. That kind of race as subject matter, which may have come from a student's experience of race, but could also come from, personal learning or other kinds of ways of learning that kind of race-related subject matter. It's that subject matter and that expertise it's what is the person gained relating to race that is part of this admissions attribute. And I think this is just really helpful to visualize that you can't miss one of these links. If you're missing one of these links, you have not demonstrated that connection. So
That's
thank
great.
you so much, Trevina.
Thank you. I'll just say one thing really quickly, is that we were very intentional about describing admissions attributes separately from personal qualities, because that was the linkage. So the experiences shape the personal qualities, the qualities represent the attribute, and that's the flow. So not to trip anyone up, but that was very intentional.
That's great. So Wojtek, I'm going to ask you a question as a graduate dean who's been very proactive both before and after the decision. How do you deal with this need for balancing central oversight and local initiative in support of advancing diverse and equitable academic communities across the full range of disciplines in a graduate school, while assuring at the same time that there is strong focus on DEI innovation within legal design parameters after the decision. How do you do that as a dean, and how do you deal with the variability of departments and cultures and customs, as well as the levels of understanding that individual faculty members or their leaders have around the legal parameters?
Sure. If I could go to my first slide. So Jamie, Art, and Trevina have all alluded to differences between very centralized undergraduate admissions and the way graduate admissions work. And, some might say that graduate admissions is a bit like the Wild West. It's sort of, you've seen one department's admission process, you've seen one department's admission process. And so for us, a huge challenge was to determine how to balance centralized response to the Supreme Court decision with a long and enduring history of departmental autonomy in those areas. And so I think that one of the things that we decided to do immediately was to think about how do we need to change the central process, and what can we still allow departments the flexibility that they need. And so at the central level, clearly we needed to suppress access to information about race and ethnicity status at the time that an admission decision was considered by the department. And so we had the ability to turn that off, so to speak. But we also needed to think about, well, when do we turn it back on? Do we turn it on only when that class matriculates a year later? Or do you turn it back on when the admission decision has been made? What we decided to do, thinking through the risks of this and consulting with counsel, both internal to the university and external, was yes, they can see it once they've made an admission decision, because that will be helpful for making decisions about recruitment and reaching out to students to enable them to come. We deliberately changed the application questions to get at the granularity of the kind of information we needed about students' lived experience and the contribution that that would make to their academic program. Now, in the past, we'd recommended questions, but we had not required them. We decided that this was important enough that we would simply require those questions for all graduate applicants. And so that was a change. That was a centralization. We required departments for the first time to identify their admission committee members. We found out some departments didn't have any admission committees. They just sort of arbitrarily admitted people. Well, we forced them to give us either the names of admissions committees, or if they used the faculty as a whole, which some small departments did, to give us those names, because we wanted to reach out with workshops and training programs so that we could inform faculty about admissions best practices. We also, in addition to saying we would strongly encourage you to use holistic review practices, we developed toolkits that actually put holistic admissions rubrics that were modifiable by faculty, by departments, but we enabled them to, we assisted them in doing it, not just told them to do it. And then I think we spent a lot of time thinking about, well, what do we allow them to continue to do for themselves? And clearly there are disciplinary issues related to the kinds of backgrounds and experiences that work well for individuals in particular fields or going to particular areas. And we needed to be able to balance the centralization with the expertise of our faculty. We certainly, I think, ran the risk of potentially alienating faculty, saying that this was sort of central imposition. But we worked really closely with deans, academic deans, and department heads, explaining what it is we are trying to do, and then depending on them to help get the message through to the individual faculty members. And we found that there was broad spread agreement around these principles. And 1 year later, looking at the numbers of students from historically underrepresented backgrounds, they're actually up at the undergraduate and graduate level, up at the doctoral and the master's level. And so I think by paying close attention to the design principles outlined in the report, it is possible to maintain your commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. If I could go very quickly to my last slide. All right. One of the things I wanted to tell you that we did was, after I got the draft of this report, I noticed that there was these 7 important design principles that Jamie and Art had articulated. And I wondered, how do our documentations, our advice that we've given, published internally on our website, relate to those design principles? And it's one of those areas which AI works really well. And so I didn't say to AI, go search our website. I went and identified the advice that we had given to programs and that we published on our websites. And I said, could you give me an assessment of the extent to which we align with the design principles? And it was an extremely useful guide to start a conversation about, is there an area where perhaps we are too risk averse? Is there an area we could do something differently? And actually, is there a way sometimes we talk about something that maybe we could word in a different way and would expose us to a different level of risk? And, I finish up by saying that I recognize that the decisions we've made here at the University of Illinois can have to be interpreted in the context of our culture at our university, our state, our relationships with the state legislature, with our board of trustees. And each of those things has to be individualized at each institution. But I think that if you use the kind of guidance regarding legal risk zones and design elements at each institution, you can continue to move forward in attaining these mission critical diversity, equity, inclusion goals.
Thank you so much, Wojtek. I'll just ask or maybe make one clarification. I think as I understand it, in your use of AI, as you said, it was at the beginning of a conversation, but it also involved your going in and reviewing what AI gave you and making your further refinements for perfection, but it really saved a lot of time.
Absolutely. Like I mean, I would say it would save 100 hours of work, but there was work to be done after the first pass of advice from AI.
Yeah, sounds great. Do we have time for one other quick question to the panelists? You kind of teed up, Wojtek, I think a very important question for Trevina and you, which is sort of what is your insight into why schools have different measures of success in this really complex and difficult time, and how can we get on a path toward doing better? What can we say for the whole field? And Trevina, do you want to share some of your thoughts first, and then maybe Wojtek can also share his?
Sure, absolutely. This is something I think about a lot because, like Wojtek, my institution's had similar positive results. We don't have our official numbers in quite yet, but for all of the programs that we've been monitoring, we are looking very positively in terms of our diversity. So we find ourselves wanting to talk about it and encourage others, but wondering if that's going to make us a target of scrutiny because, you know, if you're doing well, why are you doing so well? And does that mean that you're really not in compliance with the law? And the reality is, it's very sad that that's a question that people have in their minds. The reality is, it goes back to what Wojtek said about the design principles. If it's designed correctly, it can be adherent to the law while also taking the time that's needed and the analysis needed to get it right. I find it's remarkable that what my observations is that the thoughtful way that we vigilantly think about compliance while giving every applicant the right degree of attention and process that it requires and deserves leads to good results. Our demographics are shifting in this country. So I heard someone describe it as, you know, it's kind of like a stream that goes by you. You know, if all you have to do is dip your cup, you know, and if you don't have holes in your cup, you're going to catch a lot of that water. And we have increasing diversity across the United States. And so there's a way to tap into that and to dip your cup into that stream. But you have to think about how it's designed. So I'm going to quickly close by saying, as an employment lawyer by trade, as well as a higher ed lawyer, we've been talking about this in the employment context for a really long time, not as much in the admissions context until now, but it's a very transferable thought process or thinking, because when you're talking about how to increase diversity in terms of employment recruitment and how you evaluate candidates in your finalist stages of offering, like, for example, a faculty position, search committees for many years have had to figure out, well, how do we think about our framework and our standards for how someone is going to manifest excellence and be tenurable and be really strong in the discipline and be someone that we want to have as part of our community for a tenured faculty member. Sometimes you have to take a step back and say, well, what are the requirements we're putting out there, and how are our search committees assessing and deciding about what it means to be great? And so kind of blowing it up and not kind of going to what we think are the traditional notions of quality, and thinking about quality in a much more broad and expansive way. I'm not assuming there are certain schools that are, and I won't name any in particular, but only certain schools that, you know, deliver the best PhDs. Those kinds of automatic assumptions had to really be held up to the light, re-examined, and some of them had to be put aside or modified in order to ensure we have really good, diverse pools, and that the search committees are rethinking how they're evaluating. So it's not about lowering standards, it's about rethinking what quality means. And that same practice can be applied in the admissions context. And I found it very useful when talking to people about that.
Yeah, and I would add that I think that both CGS and the Sloan Foundation have spoken extensively about holistic and admissions, and that's really very consistent with what Trevina had said. You know, at Illinois, last year, we had 383 admitted Latinx graduate students. This year, it's 479. So almost 100 more. And in the Black and African American students, 343 versus 386 this year. So another substantial increase. There was an article in today's New York Times that I found to be particularly unhelpful and uninformed about this topic. And, you know, I was just astonished how they presented data from some universities, very few publics in there, by the way, kind of elite universities that really, I think, confused the issue. I'll point out that some universities count as, let's say, for example, Black, any individual who self-identifies as African American or Black. Others don't count individuals who identify as multiracial. And I'm certain that the list that the New York Times has mixes those groups up in an unhelpful way. And so I think it's these kinds of sessions in which we look at this in a principled manner, using design principles, that are going to help us move forward.
Yeah, and I've heard real quickly. I've heard one way of thinking about merit is not so much merit in terms of entitlement, but what are the attributes of the students that our institution, based on our mission and our capacity, would like to serve, and what are the sort of educational and societal interests that we want to serve? What are the kinds of attributes that will achieve that? And and I think that is a much more accurate and productive way of thinking about it. But I think, Julia, we'll turn this back over to you to get our audience insights as well.
Yes, thank you, everybody. This has been a really good discussion. And just a reminder, if you're in the audience and would like to submit a question, please do that using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So the first question that came in asked this group to expand on the concept of race neutral. And I thought this was a great question because we live in a world that is not race neutral. And so there is something mind-bending about the concept of being race neutral in an admissions process. So could you unpack that a little bit for us?
I mentioned it a few times, so I can just say quickly, it's a great question, and I know it's really challenging. When I use the term race neutral, when I'm teaching about the methodology, specifically within this context, I'm not talking about whether or not a particular quality or attribute is not making any kind of racial reference, because race may be very relevant to the attribute or to the quality. I'm talking about the person we're applying it to. So we can apply it to anybody who's an applicant, potentially, without regard to their race. So that's what I mean by race neutral quality or attribute. When we look at our list of things that we want in the incoming class for students as we evaluate the next PhD cohort, though that list should be something that could be applied without regard to the person's race, even if it's got elements to it, the quality itself, that make reference to race. But someone else might be able to explain that even in a different way.
And I love that answer. And so let me just build on that. I'm going to actually elevate the second part of the question that came in, because I think it's a good concrete example. Yolanda says, I'm an African-American woman. So would I talk about how that has been that the fact that I'm African-American has been a challenge in my educational journey? Going exactly to Pravina's point, the fact that you may have had challenges and overcome them and have been able to demonstrate certain strength, perspective, or expertise, that African-American history and experience, highly relevant. You don't ignore it in the admissions process as a consequence of that.
Yeah.
Am I giving you marks or pluses because of the fact that you are an African-American woman? No, I am not. I'm looking at the quality that is associated and indistinguishable from the fact that you are an African-American woman with this experience. And so these are exceptionally fine lines we are drawing. I know Pravina is nodding her head. Jamie, and I have spent countless hours norming around questions just like this with admissions teams, trying to figure out where you say, you can't look at it this way because that's just status, but you can look at it this way because that is either perspective or experience or expertise that we value. That's the central question we've been navigating.
Yeah.
So the cause, the reason that someone has been able to gain these skills and overcome challenges is their racial experience, but it is the skills and the fact that they have overcome the challenges and shown that kind of ability that is being given the plus. And another example on the positive side might be that there's someone who is, let's say, a Latinx student who has grown up in a community that had lacked adequate health care. And it was perhaps a very isolated ethnic community. And that person has a lot of pride in their background and has developed an enormous amount of inspiration and aspiration to go to medical school and come back and serve that community. And if the medical school has identified the fact that doctors need to be able to serve all of America, including and has noticed the lack of healthcare in certain communities, and this student has developed that. They developed it from their own personal experience of race as a member of that community. And it's perfect. They should absolutely celebrate that on their application, and that can be considered, but it is not because of their identity. It's because they have real authentic aspiration, inspiration, and want to go back and serve the community that you are giving them the plus.
And I think a point you can add to that, Jamie, is that those kinds of considerations could also be given for individuals who perhaps have grown up in a underserved rural environment, or perhaps have experienced some immigration-related issues and challenges. And it isn't, the essence of it isn't the racial status, it's the experience and the lived experience. But if a student describes that in the context of their racial experiences, that's okay. Just like it's okay if they say it's because they came from a rural county.
Absolutely.
A helpful comparison. Thank you. So we've had a couple of questions about processes that the graduate school can put into place to support graduate programs. And one of these questions has to do with setting expectations or enforcing expectations for graduate programs. Specifically, someone asked when graduate programs are required to submit admissions committee members, how do you enforce that? What happens if the grad program does not submit anything? You could extend that question to other contexts as well. What if they're asked to use holistic review processes and they don't? So if you could talk a little bit, Wojtek, about how a graduate dean can position him or herself in those situations. What does it take to sort of set and enforce expectations and get the participation of graduate programs?
Yeah, I think it's really important that you be flexible and that you use multiple means of communication. So sometimes sending an email to a director of graduate studies or an executive officer, a department head, will get a response from 40, maybe 50% of the units. The question is then, how do you get the ones that are reluctant to respond? And we use a variety of different strategies. We sometimes ask the relevant associate dean with responsibility for graduate studies to see if they can help us, if you like, get the message through to motivate. And then we have to decide, well, which is the particular issue and battle that we want to take a stand on. So, for example, around the area of holistic admissions, at Illinois, we're not at the place where we can demand you have to do holistic admissions in this way. That we're just simply not ready for that as a culture. But what we can do is say, in your slate admission system where you have all the information about the students, we've created a template for adjusting rubrics so that you can identify the variables that are important for you, and then all of your individuals who review the applications can have that template in front of them. So in a sense, you're helping do the work for them. But I find your partnership with the provost conversation with the dean's conversations with the department heads can be very useful in getting you closer towards a critical mass. And then, what you do with the remainder and the outliers, I think that always has to be an individual decision. Sometimes it's go and talk to the person and see if you can move them along a little bit.
Yeah, great. So another sort of follow-up question was, could the questions that you developed, Wojtek at Illinois, be made available to others? I think this is something we've heard a lot of discussion about, what kinds of questions are you using for the essays, for the applications? Different schools have had different approaches. On the one hand, you might see a school where there is a mandatory personal essay prompt that's used across all graduate programs and that is highly attuned to the new SFFA. On the other hand, you might see schools where programs have a high degree of flexibility and are tailoring their own questions with guidance from general counsel or the dean's office. So first of all,
So
if
yeah,
your
no,
are
we
your
can share
questions
that.
shareable?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, my first slide, even though somehow the formatting got really messed up on those slides that were presented, has a link in it that has the guidance that we offered to units around just about everything. 1 month after SFFA. And in there are the questions that we were using at that time. Now, once the first admissions process had gone, we asked departments for feedback. How'd the questions go? Did your applicants understand the questions? Should we tweak the questions a little bit? And yeah, we've tweaked them just a little bit, not so much, but I think it's important to realize that this is an ongoing process, right? And it's not like you want to design your questions and that's it. But to your point, Julia, that was one of the things we decided. We are going to tell people that we're going to have them answer specific questions across the board. And we moved away from a long essay to 4 more specific prompts because we felt that that would give us the information that we needed. And we actually were thinking a little bit about generative AI as well. And if you can be a little more specific, I think sometimes that can help.
And these
Thank
are
you. And I'll just note that our question asker has helpfully found your questions and posted them for us in the Q&A. So thank you, Lauren.
And Julia and everyone, I was just going to note that on the last slide in the deck, and everyone will get the deck, there are some resources, and one of them is the diversity in the law resources that the Sloan Foundation also supported. And in those resources are some sample questions. I will say, I think Wojtek's questions are terrific. And it's great that they've actually been tried in the real world. But I think it may be helpful to refer to those questions too, because many times it's good to sort of see a sample of questions and make your own accordingly.
Yes, and we'll have a link to that resource as we wrap up. I want to save time for just one last question. We focused a great deal on admissions, but now we have a question that's more specific to outreach and recruitment. Can the panel talk about strategies that are most useful in their experience? And for example, how about partnerships with MSIs? How can these be pursued equitably and sustainably and with mutual benefit?
I'll just start off because I think Wojtek will have a lot more good examples because he's closer to the actual work. I just give advice. But I do want to say that there is a difference between there's a difference, I think, between utilizing resources that might also target certain racial groups, for example. And there's some, I've heard a lot of trepidation about using, for example, HBCU feeder programs and that kind of thing for building relationships. And I always want to remind people, many of the programs we're talking about may serve certain constituencies more than others in terms of their targets or their history or their culture, but they're still subject to the same laws. And so having partnerships, for example, I'm here in Washington, D.C., we've got Howard right here. Building those strong relationships and connections are really strong because and good to do because, not just Black people go to Howard, so I think that's something that I always dispel that first, because I got that question a lot and had to chuckle a little bit. But I think that's a little bit, it's sometimes more challenging to figure out how to leverage resources and opportunities that are themselves maybe not required to be subjected to the same requirements. So we have certain kinds of partnerships, for example, where they're not specifically in higher education, so they might not be subject to Title VI in the same way, but they're trying to provide opportunities for our graduate students to do certain work, but they're focused on having a certain type of student from a certain racial background to be able to fulfill their own diversity objectives. Those are a little harder, and I'll be interested in hearing what others have to say about that. But just to kind of make sure we clarify that first part.
Yeah, I would say that it's important to remember, right, that people are not applying to the graduate college to go to grad school. They're applying to a department. And oftentimes they care about the department's resources, the people who are in the department, who their advisor might be. So whenever we build these kind of partnerships and relationships, it can't be the dean of the graduate college or the assistant dean for diversity that goes out and tries to recruit students. It has to be a partnership with the units. And we've been most successful in 2 projects funded by the Sloan Foundation. One has been the University Centers for Exemplary Mentoring, where we engaged with 17 STEM departments to recruit 172 underrepresented minority graduate students over the last 9 years, PhD students, to come to Illinois. But what we're doing right now is we're also partnering with a community college that focuses on STEM in Chicago, and with our engineering and LAS college, Liberal Arts and Sciences, and we're trying to get those kids more recently. What we're not doing is going to Howard and taking a ticket and being one of the 35 institutions trying to build a relationship with Howard, because I don't think we're going to be more successful than American University or GWU. And so it's about trying to figure out what's the pathway that is going to work, not just for the institution centrally, but also for the units that we have, and figuring out what's best and most likely to be successful.
One thing that I just want to add to all the good thoughts that have been elevated is that I think it's really important to value what an HBCU or an MSI actually has to offer in its expertise. Those institutions have really focused on finding the promise in each student and helping and creating a welcoming and inclusive environment where all students can thrive. And that kind of expertise, if it is authentically valued by your institution, is not about what their demographics are. It is about how they have handled their pedagogy and the way they determine how do you sort of have this kind of service merit perspective. And that's something that a principally white institution can and should value highly. And so I think that actually this goes back to something that Trivina said about the admissions attributes. If you actually step back and say, why are we doing this? It's not numbers, it's not demographics. It's about the fact we want to create an inclusive environment where all students will thrive. And these institutions have really achieved excellence in doing that. And so we have a lot to learn from them, and we want to gain their students that have gone through that kind of environment and can help bring that to our institution.
I think that's a great note to end on. And again, we are so grateful to our speakers for this really helpful discussion today. I'll close with just a few announcements. And I hope that you will continue connecting with CGS around this topic. Forthcoming from CGS will be a resource for faculty. As many people said today, it's really important that we focus these discussions about graduate education admissions and other environmental issues within programs. And so our resource, which will be forthcoming this fall, will provide promising practices for supporting equity in changing legal landscapes, with many examples, which is something that I know that many programs are hungry for, and supporting tools and resources. Next slide. Also out in the community right now are a wide variety of resources that are broadly applicable to higher education, not just graduate education. And so we just want to signal that these are really excellent resources that are available to you. And again, this will be available in the slide deck and in the recording that we circulate. And then just a final reminder that the CGS annual meeting is coming up in December in St. Louis. We'll continue our discussion about these topics there, and we encourage you to register. So with that, I'll wish everyone a really good end of week, and upcoming weekend. And we look forward to continuing to collaborating and communicating about these really important issues with you. Thank you, everyone.